risk management, it's important to understand what the risks are that you're facing in your fund and how you manage that. And in particular, are there areas that you have conflicts? Are those manageable conflicts, or is there something that you actually need to do to avoid that conflict completely? Making sure that you have special fidelity insurance cover in place to protect the fund against fraud, negligence, etc. Say there's a mistake with the benefit calculation, that there is some sort of protection there in terms of the management of the fund. And then investment performance and fund assets. Having an investment policy document is extremely important for funds, giving you guidance in terms of what are your objectives, what are your targets, what sort of asset classes do you invest in to achieve that, and what sort of risk do you take on to obtain the objectives. And then the management of multi-stakeholder relationships. So communication and access to information. So making sure that everything that you have that you're coming to site with is confidential, because you have access to a lot of information. You have an agreement between the board that anything that you share and discuss there is confidential, unless it is agreed that it can then be taken out and communicated to stakeholders. And then communication, and it's something that we found now during the COVID-19 lockdowns, that communication and information to members, directly to members, is critical to make sure that there is proper messaging and that they can understand what you are doing as a board for them in terms of managing the fund. So in terms of communicating with members and beneficiaries, we have communication policies. So you actually set out what it is that you want from a strategic and an operational perspective, and then from an employer perspective to maintain that channel. Obviously, employer is the sponsor ultimately of the fund, and you want to maintain and keep that engagement open with the employer. And then we have the regulator that is key to managing the statutory requirements and making sure from a board perspective that you then comply with those requirements that have been put in place. So we have 6 fairness outcomes for retirement funds that we have. It's not regulation in South Africa, but it is underlying in our regulation as to how we manage our retirement funds in considering how we manage and communicate with members. So members are confident in the company and the fund in terms of the culture that it brings. So there's trust, that benefits take into account needs, that the information that is given to members is clear information that they can understand, and that any advice takes into account the members' individual circumstances. And then basically whatever is in place behaves and delivers as expected to those members. And then if a member wants to complain or if they want out of something, that there is no unreasonable barrier to that. So supporting members, so giving them ability to be able to complain, and basically having a policy in place that can deal with that to make sure that we treat customers fairly in all aspects. And then corporate governance. So as directors of companies, it is important that you have governance processes in place. And that role is pretty much the same for boards of trustees. As trustees, you're seen as critical stakeholders, as governing other people's money and looking after it on their behalf. And therefore, there are certain requirements that need to be met. In South Africa, we have King IV, where there are 17 principles that either you need to apply, and if you don't apply these principles, you need to explain why you have not applied them. And it is extremely important from an auditing perspective that we do respond and reply in terms of how we have incorporated these key principles in our policies that we have in place as a board of trustees. So if you look at the top, the idea of, or the process of King IV is to steer and set strategic direction. It helps approve the policies and planning. It provides overseeing and monitoring and ensures accountability. And that is built into the policy documents that we essentially put forward to our trustees. So looking at the ethical culture of the fund, the performance and value creation that we bring through into the management of the fund, making sure that there are adequate and effective controls. And then obviously trust is key, having a good reputation and legitimacy of your fund. You want members to be able to be confident, comfortable, and trust in what is happening with their money. So just in terms of our reporting as well, we look at sustainable development in terms of investments. I've spoken about the governance outcomes, so ethical culture, good performance, effective controls, legitimacy, and then incorporating our principles. And then that supports in what we've brought in terms of treating customers fairly. We also have our governance regulations that look at the policies that we put in place, how we invest funds money, and then again, treating customers fairly is central to that as well. So just in terms of the policies, implementation and measurement and reporting, we have board charters and codes of conduct that we use, a risk management policy, which is key in identifying and mitigating risk, your investment policy statement, which gives direction as to how you invest and what your objectives are. Having a communication policy also helps set what is a strategic communication in terms of, say, around COVID-19, and what is operational. So your annual trustee report, your benefit statements, but what other key information do you need to put out there to support members? I've spoken about performance assessments. It's important to manage and make sure that you are actually achieving what you're setting out to do as a board of trustees in managing your fund. And then complaints, having a facility to allow members to channel their complaints on the fund. A trustee training policy, so how are you actually going to train and upskill to be able to deliver the sensation and make sure that you can effectively manage the fund. And then in South Africa, we also have unclaimed benefit policies. So we have a number of unclaimed members on funds. So we strategize as to how we manage that, how we invest that money, and how we trace those members. And then also annuity policies. So we have regulation that provides recommended annuity strategies, or boards choose a recommended annuity strategy, and to have that in a policy so that when we come back as a board to look at, what is it that we've done, we can actively measure our process. So your board charter and code of conduct just looks at the purpose. How are you going to manage the fund with good governance? What are the responsibilities? And acting in utmost good faith. Your objectives, so what are your objectives as a board in terms of the legislation and in terms of your principles of good governance? And then underlying that, the statutory obligations that you need to meet as a board of trustees. If we look at the risk management framework, you need to identify what are the risks that you see as the board of trustees in terms of legal, administration, risk benefits, investments, and identifying those and devising a strategy to either minimize the risk, mitigate the risk. So sometimes if there is a risk, it doesn't mean that you need to avoid it altogether, but there might be a way that you can actually manage and mitigate. And implement the strategy to see how does that meet your requirements as a board, and reviewing that at least annually to reaffirm, is the strategy correct? Is there anything else that we can identify that could potentially impact our management of the fund? For example, COVID-19, the impact on investment performance and the risk that members will not meet their outcomes. Have we identified that? Is it enough of a risk? And what are we going to do once we come out of this to try and help members get back on track for their retirement savings? Your investment policy statement, that's key, as I've said before, to identifying, what are the objectives? How do we want to achieve the outcome? And how are we going to invest the money in the fund to achieve that? And then looking at various elements that you will deal with as a trustee in terms of setting those investment objectives and the requirements for members and for the asset managers to meet those objectives. So I've highlighted from a communication perspective, you've got operational, your normal annual requirements or normal communications with members versus strategic. Are you on track with your retirement?